Welcome to the Ghastly Journal. Tonight we journey back to the early days of the Oregon Territory, when the land was still wild and secrets lurked in the shadows of the ancient forests. Before settlers had tamed the wilderness, before the Oregon Trail brought waves of pioneers westward, this territory was a place of mystery and danger, a frontier where the line between the known world and the unknown sometimes blurred in ways that defy explanation. In the winter of 1817, as snow blanketed the rugged terrain of what would later become the state of Oregon, a peculiar tale began to unfold at the Blackwood Orphan Asylum. Nestled between the dense woods and the raging Columbia River, this institution stood as a grim monument to both charity and isolation. Its imposing three-story structure, with narrow windows and weathered clapboard siding, cast long shadows across the snow-covered clearing that had been carved from the surrounding forest. Smoke curled from its chimneys day and night, though little warmth seemed to penetrate the building's cold interior. The asylum had been established 5 years prior by Reverend Silas Thorne, a stern Episcopalian minister who had journeyed west with the belief that God had called him to bring order to the frontier. Using funds from wealthy East Coast benefactors, he constructed a 3-story building of dark timber and stone, designed to house the growing number of orphaned children in the territory. The asylum's reputation spread throughout the scattered settlements of the region, a place where unwanted children could receive shelter, religious instruction, and the strict discipline Reverend Thorne believed essential for salvation. The Reverend was a tall man with a hawkish face and deep-set eyes that seemed to pierce through pretense and falsehood. His gaunt frame was invariably clothed in black, from his high collar to his polished boots. He wore his graying hair cropped short, and his beard was meticulously trimmed each morning with a straight razor. Those who knew him spoke of his unflinching commitment to his calling, though few mentioned warmth or compassion when describing his character. In his mind, kindness without discipline was a path to moral corruption, and he governed Blackwood accordingly. The winter of 1817 was particularly harsh. The biting cold seeped through the walls of the asylum, and supplies from Fort Astoria were dwindling. Ice formed on the inside of windows, and the children huddled together at night for warmth, their threadbare blankets providing little protection against the chill. Reverend Thorne had imposed strict rationing, and the children, already thin and pale, grew weaker as the season progressed. In the dormitories, coughing echoed through the night as lung ailments spread among the most vulnerable. It was during this time that Miss Eleanor Winters arrived at Blackwood. A young woman of 23 years, she had traveled from Boston to serve as a teacher to the orphans. Her journey had been arduous, months on a merchant vessel around Cape Horn, followed by a treacherous overland trek from the coast. The voyage had nearly claimed her life when a violent storm had threatened to capsize their ship off the coast of Chile. Later, the brutal overland journey through wilderness had exposed her to dangers she had scarcely imagined in her sheltered Boston upbringing: raging rivers that needed crossing, hostile encounters with suspicious natives, and nights spent listening to the howls of wolves circling their camp. Yet despite her fatigue, Miss Winters maintained an air of quiet determination. She was not a conventionally beautiful woman, but her features were pleasing. Intelligent gray eyes, a heart-shaped face framed by chestnut hair typically arranged in a simple bun, and a mouth that seemed naturally inclined to smile, though she had learned to suppress this tendency in formal company. She dressed modestly in dark dresses with high collars, though the quality of the fabric and stitching betrayed her genteel background. Miss Winters had come west following a personal tragedy. The death of her fiancé to typhoid fever had left her seeking purpose beyond the confining social circles of Boston society. Teaching had always been her passion, though her family had considered it merely a suitable occupation until marriage. Now, with her prospects for matrimony voluntarily abandoned, she had embraced her calling with renewed dedication, convinced that even in this remote outpost, she could make a meaningful difference in young lives. "The children require education if they are to make their way in this world," she had written in her journal upon arrival. "Though I confess, there is something about this place that unsettles the spirit. Perhaps it is merely the isolation, or the constant moaning of the wind through the pines. I shall endeavor to put such fancies aside and focus on my duties." Her first night at Blackwood had been a restless one. The small room assigned to her was Spartan: an iron bedstead with a thin mattress, a wooden chair, a washstand with a cracked basin, and a small writing desk positioned beneath the room's single window. The walls were bare save for a wooden crucifix hanging above the bed. A small fireplace provided inadequate heat, and the chimney drew poorly, occasionally sending gusts of smoke back into the room. As she lay awake, listening to the creaking of the building and the distant sounds of children coughing, Miss Winters had wondered if she had made a terrible mistake in coming to this desolate place. But with the dawn came renewed resolve. These children needed her, perhaps more than any pupils she might have taught in Boston's comfortable schoolrooms. Reverend Thorne had received Miss Winters with thinly veiled skepticism. Women of education were rare on the frontier, and he made it clear that religious instruction was to take precedence over secular learning. Nevertheless, he assigned her a small room on the second floor and permitted her to begin classes the following day. He had presented her with a copy of the asylum's rules, a lengthy document detailing the rigid schedule and harsh punishments for infractions that governed the children's lives. The orphanage housed 37 children, ranging in age from 4 to 16. Many were the offspring of trappers and settlers who had succumbed to disease or the countless dangers of frontier life. Others were the children of native mothers and European fathers, abandoned when the men returned east. A few were from the indigenous tribes decimated by smallpox, with no remaining relatives to claim them. Each child bore the marks of loss and hardship, in their wary eyes, in their tendency to hoard scraps of food, in their flinching at sudden movements. There was Thomas, a serious 12-year-old with watchful eyes, who had witnessed his parents' death in a river crossing gone wrong. Mary, whose distinctive birthmark covering half her face had led to abandonment by superstitious parents, who saw it as a mark of the devil. James, the bitter 14-year-old whose trapper father had been killed by a grizzly bear, leaving him and his 3 younger siblings to fend for themselves until they were brought to Blackwood. And Sarah, a quiet 8-year-old of mixed heritage, whose dark eyes seemed to hold secrets beyond her years. The classroom was located on the first floor, a long room with rough-hewn benches and tables, a small blackboard, and a few tattered books. The windows were small and set high in the walls, letting in little light, necessitating the use of oil lamps even during daylight hours. The air was perpetually cold and damp, carrying the musty scent of the building's timber frame. Miss Winters quickly noted the pallor and listlessness of her young charges. Their clothing was threadbare, their eyes downcast. Many showed signs of malnutrition, protruding collarbones, dull hair, and in the youngest, the slightly distended bellies that spoke of prolonged hunger. During her first lesson, she attempted to engage them with stories of the eastern cities, hoping to inspire curiosity. "Can anyone tell me what they know of Boston?" she had asked. The room remained silent, save for the crackling of the meager fire in the hearth. The children stared at her with a mixture of curiosity and wariness, as though unaccustomed to being asked for their thoughts rather than receiving instructions or admonishments. Miss Winters tried again. "Boston is a city of great learning, with universities and libraries filled with more books than you could read in a lifetime. There are streets paved with cobblestones instead of dirt, and buildings taller than the tallest trees. In the harbor, ships from all over the world bring goods and people from distant lands." A few of the children showed flickers of interest, sitting up straighter, their eyes widening at the descriptions of a world so different from the isolated existence they knew. Encouraged, Miss Winters continued, describing the bustling markets, the horse-drawn carriages, the theaters and concert halls where people gathered for entertainment. Finally, a small girl named Sarah, no more than 8 years old, raised her hand. She wore a faded dress that had clearly been mended multiple times, and her dark hair was neatly braided, though lacking the ribbons that might have adorned a more fortunate child. Her eyes, however, held a spark of intelligence that caught Miss Winters's attention immediately. "Is it near the hollow place, miss?" she asked in a whisper that nonetheless carried in the hushed classroom. "The hollow place?" Miss Winters echoed, confused by the question. She glanced around to see if the other children might provide clarification, but was struck by the sudden tension that had fallen over the room. Several children shot warning glances at Sarah, while others stared fixedly at their desks, as though afraid to meet Miss Winters' gaze. Before Sarah could respond, Mrs. Beatrice Crow, the matron who oversaw the children's daily care, rapped her cane sharply on the floor. She had been observing the lesson from the back of the room, her presence a looming reminder of the strict discipline that governed Blackwood. Mrs. Crow was a formidable woman in her 50s, with a perpetual scowl etched into her features and gray hair pulled back so severely it seemed to stretch her skin. Her black dress was immaculate despite the dusty conditions of the asylum, and the bunch of keys at her waist jingled ominously with every movement. a constant reminder of her authority. "Enough of that nonsense," she barked. "You'll not be filling their heads with more fanciful notions, Miss Winters. These children need discipline, not encouragement of their wild imaginations." Her voice carried the harsh edge of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. The children immediately stiffened at her tone, several flinching visibly. Sarah ducked her head, shoulders hunching as though expecting a blow. "I was merely attempting to engage them in discussion, Mrs. Crow," Miss Winters replied, striving to keep her voice even, despite the anger rising within her at the woman's interruption and the fear it had clearly instilled in the children. "Discussion leads to questioning, and questioning leads to disobedience," Mrs. Crow replied coldly. "You would do well to remember that these are not the coddled children of Boston's elite. These are wild creatures requiring firm guidance lest they fall into sin and degeneracy." She fixed her gaze on Sarah. "As for you, girl, we've spoken before about your fanciful tales. Another word of such nonsense and you'll spend the night in reflection." The threat hung in the air, and Miss Winters noted how the other children seemed to shrink further into themselves. She had not yet learned what reflection entailed, but the dread on the children's faces told her it was no minor punishment. That evening, as Miss Winters recorded the day's events in her journal by candlelight, she found herself troubled by the incident. The reaction to Sarah's innocent question seemed disproportionate, suggesting something more than mere adherence to disciplinary principles. What could a child's reference to a hollow place possibly signify that would provoke such a response? And why had the other children seemed simultaneously interested in and fearful of the topic? "What is it, child?" "You should be abed at this hour," Miss Winters said, concerned by the girl's evident anxiety. "I made this for you," Sarah whispered, thrusting the paper into Miss Winters' hands before scurrying away down the darkened hall. Puzzled, Miss Winters unfolded the paper to find a crude drawing. It appeared to be a map, with the orphanage represented by a square in one corner. A winding line led through what she assumed were the surrounding woods to a circular area marked with strange symbols. Around the circle, Sarah had drawn several stick figures holding hands. Miss Winters studied the drawing with growing curiosity. Was this the hollow place Sarah had mentioned during the lesson? The careful detail suggested this was more than a child's idle doodling. There was purpose in the precise route marked through the forest, in the strange symbols around the circle, in the joyful postures of the stick figures. She held the map closer to the candle, noting what appeared to be landmarks along the path. A distinctively shaped rock, a fallen tree bridging a small stream, what might be a peculiar formation of 3 pines growing in a perfect triangle. These details spoke of observation and familiarity with the terrain, suggesting Sarah had either visited this place or had been given very specific instructions about how to find it. Miss Winters tucked the drawing into her journal, securing it between the pages with a sense that she had been entrusted with something important, though she couldn't yet comprehend its significance. She made a brief note about the incident, describing the map and Sarah's furtive behavior. The night grew colder, and Miss Winters added another log to her small fire before retiring to bed. As she drifted toward sleep, her mind filled with images from the map, the circled area with its mysterious symbols, the smiling figures holding hands. In her half-dreaming state, she imagined she could hear distant singing, a melody both strange and somehow familiar, calling her toward the woods. The following morning, she attempted to question Sarah, but the girl averted her eyes and claimed no knowledge of the map. "I don't know what you mean, miss," she said softly when Miss Winters pulled her aside after breakfast. Her gaze remained fixed on the floor, and her small hands fidgeted nervously with the frayed edge of her apron. "Sarah, you're not in any trouble," Miss Winters assured her. "I simply wish to understand what you drew. What is this hollow place you mentioned?" The child's eyes darted nervously to where Mrs. Crow stood across the dining hall, supervising the cleaning of breakfast dishes with her customary scowl. "I can't say, miss," Sarah whispered. "They're listening." Before Miss Winters could press further, Thomas appeared at Sarah's side. "Pardon, Miss Winters," he said with a politeness that seemed practiced. "Sarah is needed in the laundry room." His eyes met Miss Winters briefly, and she detected a warning there, a silent plea to let the matter drop. As the days passed, Miss Winters observed troubling patterns at Blackwood. The children were required to rise before dawn for prayers, followed by cold baths regardless of the temperature, a practice Reverend Thorne insisted would fortify their constitutions and cleanse their spirits. The water came from a well in the courtyard and was carried in buckets to the washrooms. where it sat in large wooden tubs, often developing a thin layer of ice overnight. The children would silently line up, boys to one side, girls to the other, to endure their daily immersion under Mrs. Crow's watchful eye. Meals consisted primarily of thin porridge and hard bread, with the occasional addition of salted pork or dried beans when supplies allowed. The food was prepared in the asylum's cavernous kitchen by a stoic cook named Mrs. Porter, a widow whose husband had been lost in a hunting accident the previous year. Though not unkind, she adhered strictly to Reverend Thorne's instructions regarding portions, which were meager at best. Miss Winters noted that the Reverend and Mrs. Crow dined separately and appeared to enjoy more substantial fare, including fresh meat and vegetables preserved from the autumn harvest. Most afternoons were dedicated to work, the boys chopping wood and tending livestock, the girls cleaning and mending. The children toiled silently, their small hands reddened from harsh lye soap and cold water, their backs bent under loads that seemed excessive for their slight frames. Even the youngest were assigned tasks, sorting laundry, polishing boots, or fetching water from the well. Infractions of the many rules were met with harsh punishment, often in the form of confinement in the windowless cells in the asylum's basement. These chambers, originally intended as root cellars, had been converted to reflection rooms, where disobedient children were sent to contemplate their sins in darkness and isolation. The duration of confinement varied according to the perceived severity of the transgression, from several hours for minor offenses like speaking during meals, to days for more serious infractions such as attempted escape. They must learn early that idle hands invite the devil's work, Reverend Thorne explained when Miss Winters expressed concern over the children's exhaustion. They stood in his office, a well-appointed room with a large desk of polished oak, walls lined with theological texts, and a roaring fire that made the space uncomfortably warm compared to the chill that permeated the rest of the building. A portrait of Reverend Thorne hung above the fireplace, depicting him with the same stern expression he wore in person, his hand resting on a Bible. We prepare them for a life of honest labor, not indulgence. But surely some allowance could be made for their age and constitution, Miss Winters argued, thinking of young Peter, a frail boy of 6 who had collapsed while carrying firewood the previous day. The younger ones especially are overtaxed, and the diet is insufficient for growing children. Reverend Thorne's expression hardened. Your sympathies, while natural for a woman, are misplaced, Miss Winters. These children come to us wild and undisciplined. Many are the offspring of trappers and native women, carrying the taint of savage blood. Others have been abandoned by parents of low moral character. Only through rigorous structure and the suppression of their baser natures can they hope to become productive members of society. He rose from behind his desk, clasping his hands behind his back as he moved to gaze out the window at the children working in the yard below. You have been brought here to provide basic instruction in letters and numbers, as our benefactors insist this is necessary. But make no mistake, your primary purpose is to instill obedience and Christian virtue. Leave matters of physical welfare and discipline to those with more experience in such things. The dismissal was clear, and Miss Winters left the office seething with barely contained anger. The Reverend's words revealed a disturbing philosophy that viewed the children not as innocent souls deserving of care and nurturing, but as inherently flawed creatures requiring harsh correction. It ran counter to everything she believed about education and childhood development. Despite the strict regimen, Miss Winters began to notice curious behaviors among her pupils. They whispered among themselves when they thought no adults were listening, falling silent immediately when Mrs. Crow or Reverend Thorne approached. Occasionally, she would enter the classroom to find them hastily concealing papers. At night, she sometimes heard the soft padding of bare feet in the corridors, though when she investigated, she found only empty hallways. 3 weeks after her arrival, Miss Winters discovered a second map, this one tucked between the pages of a primer left on her desk. Unlike the first, which had clearly been drawn by Sarah's inexperienced hand, this map showed greater skill and attention to detail. The forest was depicted with individual trees, their types distinguishable by the shapes of their crowns, the pointed spires of pines, the rounded domes of oaks, the distinctive silhouettes of what appeared to be the cottonwoods that grew along the riverbanks. The path from the orphanage to the circular area was marked with specific landmarks: a lightning-struck tree, a curious rock formation resembling a crouching bear, a small waterfall where a stream descended over a rocky ledge. This time, the circle contained a crude drawing of what appeared to be a doorway or entrance, surrounded by trees with peculiarly twisted trunks. Inside the doorway was a golden light, rendered in what looked like yellow clay or perhaps the yolk of an egg. Along the bottom of the map ran a series of the same strange symbols Miss Winters had seen on the first drawing. They were arranged in a pattern that suggested writing, though in no alphabet she recognized from her studies. The careful penmanship indicated this had been drawn by one of the older children, though which one she couldn't guess. That same evening, unable to sleep, Miss Winters stood at her window, gazing out at the moonlit forest. The night was clear, the full moon casting the landscape in silvery light that transformed the familiar into something otherworldly. The snow covering the ground reflected the moonlight, creating an ethereal glow that seemed to blur the boundary between earth and sky. A movement caught her eye, a small figure darting between the trees at the edge of the cleared land surrounding the asylum. The child, for it was clearly a child, was bundled against the cold and moved with purpose, following what appeared to be a predetermined path. Then another small shape emerged from the shadows of the building, hurrying to join the first, and another. With growing alarm, she realized that several children were venturing into the woods in the dead of night. Hastily donning her coat and boots, Miss Winters slipped down the servants' staircase, a narrow, winding passage that servants used to move through the building unobtrusively. The stairs creaked beneath her weight, and she paused at each sound, heart pounding, fearful of discovery. Being caught wandering the asylum at night would certainly draw unwelcome questions and possibly jeopardize her position. The kitchen was deserted at this hour, the large hearth containing only the dull red glow of banked coals. Copper pots hung from hooks along the wall, their polished surfaces reflecting faint glimmers of light. The smell of the day's meager stew still lingered in the air, mingling with the yeasty scent of bread dough rising for tomorrow's baking. Miss Winters located a small lantern hanging by the door, but decided against lighting it. The flame might be spotted from the upper windows where Reverend Thorne or Mrs. Crow might still be awake. Instead, she relied on the moonlight as she slipped out through the kitchen door, wincing as the hinges groaned. The bitter cold stung her face as she followed the children's tracks in the fresh snow. Her breath formed clouds of vapor that dissipated in the still night air. The snow crunched beneath her feet, and she tried to step where the children had already broken the crust, hoping to muffle the sound of her passage. The forest loomed before her, a wall of darkness broken only by shafts of moonlight penetrating the canopy. The towering pines stood like sentinels, their branches laden with snow that occasionally fell in soft thuds when disturbed by a passing breeze. Somewhere in the distance an owl hooted, the sound echoing through the silent woods. Miss Winters hesitated at the tree line, her Boston upbringing having instilled a natural wariness of wilderness, particularly at night. But concern for the children drove her forward. The forest closed around her like a living thing, branches reaching out to snag her clothing, roots concealed beneath the snow threatening to trip her with each step. She followed the trail of small footprints, now joined in a single path that wound between the massive tree trunks. What she saw there stopped her in her tracks. 7 children from the orphanage stood in a circle holding hands. In the center of their circle lay a flat stone, roughly circular in shape and perhaps 3 feet in diameter. The stone appeared out of place in the forest clearing. Its surface was too smooth to be natural, and it bore faint carvings around its circumference that matched the strange symbols from the children's maps. The moonlight seemed to gather on its surface, giving it a subtle luminescence that might have been a trick of the light or something more inexplicable. Upon this stone, the children had placed various small objects: a doll made of corn husks with a face stitched in dark thread, a carved wooden horse that Miss Winters recognized as Thomas's prized possession, reportedly carved by his father, a faded blue ribbon that Sarah often wore in her hair on Sundays, a piece of bread that must have been saved from the meager evening meal, and a crude knife fashioned from a sharpened stone bound to a wooden handle with strips of rawhide. These offerings were arranged in a specific pattern that echoed the symbols carved into the stone: the doll at what would be north if the stone were a compass, the horse at east, the ribbon at south, the bread at west, and the stone knife in the precise center. The children were singing softly, a melody Miss Winters did not recognize, with words in a language she could not identify. It was not English, nor French, nor any European tongue she had encountered in her studies. It had a lilting, almost hypnotic quality, rising and falling like waves upon a shore. The children's voices blended in perfect harmony, as though they had practiced this song countless times. As they sang, A strange luminescence seemed to emanate from the stone, casting eerie shadows across their faces. It began as a faint glow, like the phosphorescence sometimes seen in rotting wood, but gradually intensified until it illuminated the entire clearing with a soft, bluish light. The snow reflected this glow, amplifying it, creating an otherworldly scene that sent a shiver down Miss Winters's spine. The glow pulsed in rhythm with the children's song, growing brighter with certain notes and phrases, as if responding to specific words or tones. Small motes of light, like luminous snowflakes or fireflies, began to rise from the stone surface, swirling in the air above the circle. They danced in patterns that seemed deliberate rather than random, forming shapes that briefly resembled the symbols from the maps before dissolving and reforming into new configurations. The air in the clearing felt different, warmer than the surrounding forest despite the winter night, and charged with an energy that made the hairs on Miss Winter's arms stand on end beneath her coat sleeves. There was a scent, too, unlike the usual piney aroma of the forest, something sweet and foreign, like exotic flowers or fruits she had encountered on her sea voyage, brought from distant lands. For several minutes, Miss Winter stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, unable to tear her eyes away from the uncanny scene. Part of her mind, the rational, educated part, sought logical explanations. Perhaps the stone contained some mineral that reacted to the cold or the moonlight. Perhaps the strange light was merely an atmospheric phenomenon, like the aurora borealis she had read about. Perhaps the children had discovered some phosphorescent fungus and spread it on the stone to create their magic. But another part of her, a deeper, more intuitive part, recognized that she was witnessing something that defied conventional explanation, something ancient and powerful that had existed in these woods long before European settlers had arrived with their churches and schools and rigid notions of reality. Her movement, a small step back as she processed what she was seeing, snapped a twig beneath her boot. The sound, though slight, carried in the stillness of the clearing. "Children," she called out, her voice shaking. "What are you doing out here? You'll catch your death." The singing stopped abruptly, the last notes hanging in the air like the reverberations of a bell. The glowing motes above the stone flickered and faded, though the stone itself continued to emit a faint luminescence. The children turned to her, their expressions a mixture of fear and something else, something akin to disappointment or frustration, as though she had interrupted a crucial task moments before its completion. "You shouldn't have followed us, miss," said Thomas, a solemn boy of 12. His face, typically guarded and expressionless within the asylum walls, now showed animation and purpose. In the fading glow from the stone, his features seemed older somehow, as though the ritual had temporarily aged him. "Adults can't see the way." His words carried a certainty that gave Miss Winters pause. There was no defiance in his tone, merely a statement of what he clearly believed to be fact. "What way? See what?" Miss Winters demanded, stepping into the clearing. Despite her effort to sound authoritative, her voice trembled slightly. The stone's faint glow seemed to dim further as she approached, as if retreating from her presence. "This is dangerous foolishness. We're returning to the asylum at once." She tried to project confidence, but inwardly she was torn between concern for the children's safety and an unsettling sense that she had stumbled upon something significant, something the children understood, but she did not. "We've been trying to open the door," said Sarah, who stood opposite Thomas in the circle. The small girl's face was unusually animated, her eyes bright with purpose despite the late hour and frigid conditions. "But it won't open all the way yet. We need more time, and more of us," added another child, a girl named Mary with a birthmark covering half her face. Her typically timid demeanor had been replaced by a quiet intensity. "The hollow place wants more children before it will let us in." The other children nodded in agreement, their expressions solemn yet eager, like devotees participating in a sacred rite. None showed any sign of the cold despite their inadequate clothing, thin night clothes covered by whatever outer garments they had been able to salvage or hide away. Miss Winters felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. There was something unsettling about the children's unified belief, their matter-of-fact discussion of doors and hollow places, as if these were concrete realities rather than fanciful imaginings. More disturbing still was their apparent immunity to the cold, their bright eyes and energetic movements contrasting sharply with their usual listless demeanor within the asylum. "There is no door here, no hollow place," she said firmly, though a small voice in the back of her mind questioned her certainty. She gestured at their surroundings. The moonlit clearing, the trees, the stone with its fading glow. Just the woods and the night, both of which are perilous. Now come, before your absence is discovered. The consequences would be severe if Reverend Thorne learned of this midnight excursion. Images of the basement cells flashed through Miss Winter's mind. The children confined in darkness, perhaps for days, subsisting on bread and water while contemplating their sins. She could not bear the thought of being responsible for such punishment, however indirectly. Reluctantly, the children broke their circle and gathered their offerings. Thomas carefully lifted the stone knife, wrapping it in a scrap of cloth before tucking it inside his shirt. Sarah reclaimed her ribbon, tying it around her wrist rather than returning it to her hair. The wooden horse disappeared into Thomas's pocket, the doll into Mary's, and the piece of bread was divided among the youngest children, who ate it in small, careful bites as they prepared to return. As they trudged back toward the orphanage, Miss Winters glanced back at the clearing. For an instant, though she later convinced herself it was a trick of the moonlight, she thought she saw a shimmer in the air above the stone, like heat rising from a summer road. Within that shimmer, colors swirled that had no place in the monochrome winter night, gold and green and a blue more vivid than any sky. Then it was gone, leaving only the ordinary stone in the ordinary clearing, bathed in ordinary moonlight. The return journey seemed longer, the forest more hostile. Without the children singing, the night sounds reasserted themselves. The distant howl of wolves, the creaking of branches, the occasional rush of snow falling from overburdened boughs. The children moved with surprising surety despite the darkness, clearly familiar with the path. They walked in silence, their earlier animation fading with each step closer to the asylum, their faces gradually resuming the guarded expressions they typically wore within its walls. Miss Winters shepherded them through the kitchen door, grateful to find the building still silent and dark. Had anyone noticed their absence? It seemed unlikely. Mrs. Crow, though vigilant during the day, was known to indulge in brandy each evening, a habit that ensured her sleep was deep and uninterrupted. Reverend Thorne retired to his private quarters after evening prayers and rarely emerged before dawn. The other staff, Mrs. Porter the cook, Mr. Jenkins the groundskeeper, and the two maids, lived in a separate building behind the asylum. "Straight to your beds now," Miss Winters whispered as they entered the rear hallway. "And not a word of this to anyone, do you understand? I'll not see you punished, but neither will I permit further night wanderings." The children nodded obediently, though she noted exchanged glances that suggested her prohibition might not be as effective as she hoped. They dispersed silently, the girls climbing the stairs to their dormitory on the second floor, the boys heading for theirs on the third. Miss Winters watched until they had disappeared, then made her way to her own room, her mind churning with questions. Back at the asylum, she ushered the children to their dormitories with strict instructions to remain in their beds. Then she returned to her room and recorded the night's events in her journal, her hand trembling slightly as she wrote. The rational part of her mind sought explanations. The stone's glow might have been phosphorescent minerals, the children's immunity to cold merely the resilience of youth, their talk of doors and hollow places simply the elaborate fantasy of minds seeking escape from a harsh reality. Yet she could not dismiss the visceral certainty that she had witnessed something beyond her understanding. The quality of the light, the strange energy in the air, the way the stone's glow had responded to the children's singing. These details nagged at her, resisting rational categorization. "I cannot fathom what notion has taken hold of these children," she concluded. "Perhaps it is a game they have invented to escape the grimness of their circumstances." Yet the conviction in their eyes when they spoke of this hollow place was unsettling. The elaborate nature of their ritual, the maps, the offerings, all suggest this is more than a passing fancy. I shall speak with them individually on the morrow and get to the bottom of this peculiar behavior. She closed her journal and placed it in the drawer of her writing desk, turning the small key in its lock. Then she prepared for bed, though sleep seemed unlikely given the tumult of her thoughts. As she lay in the darkness, she found herself listening for the sounds of small feet in the corridor, half expecting the children to attempt another journey to the clearing. But the asylum remained silent, save for the usual creaking of the old building as it settled in the cold night. When sleep finally came, her dreams were filled with strange imagery, circular stones that glowed with inner light, doorways appearing in empty air, children walking hand in hand into a golden radiance. She woke several times, disoriented, the boundary between dream and memory momentarily blurred, before falling back into restless slumber. The following day, however, her plans were interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Ambrose Pike, a physician from Fort Astoria. Several children had developed coughs, and Reverend Thorne, concerned about the possibility of consumption spreading through the asylum, had requested the doctor's services. Dr. Pike arrived shortly after breakfast, his horse and buggy creating a stir of excitement among the children, who rarely saw visitors from the outside world. His arrival was a welcome distraction from the mundane routine of the asylum, and even Mrs. Crow seemed less stern as she directed the preparation of the infirmary for the doctor's examinations. Dr. Pike was a man of middle years, with a neatly trimmed beard that showed the first flecks of gray and intelligent eyes that seemed to notice everything. He wore a well-made coat of dark wool, leather gloves, and sturdy boots appropriate for the frontier conditions. His medical bag, crafted of worn but well-maintained leather, contained an assortment of instruments and remedies that represented the best medical science of the day, though Miss Winters knew from her reading that such science was still woefully limited in its understanding of many diseases. Unlike many frontier physicians, who often had little formal training, Dr. Pike had studied at medical college in Philadelphia before venturing west. His manner was professional yet compassionate, and he spoke to the children directly rather than discussing them as though they were not present, a courtesy that visibly surprised them. The doctor set up his examination area in the asylum's small infirmary, a room with 4 narrow beds that was typically used to isolate children with contagious ailments. Miss Winters was assigned to assist him, bringing in each child in turn and recording his observations in a ledger. While examining the children, he engaged Miss Winters in conversation, inquiring about her background and impressions of the frontier. His manner was respectful but friendly, a welcome change from Reverend Thorne's stern formality and Mrs. Crow's perpetual disapproval. "It must be quite a change from Boston," he remarked as they walked the corridor between examinations. A window looked out over the asylum grounds, where snow had been cleared from paths connecting the main building to the barn, woodshed, and staff quarters. Beyond the cleared area, the forest stood dark and impenetrable. The isolation can be challenging. Indeed, Miss Winters agreed, appreciating his perceptiveness. The isolation had been one of the most difficult adjustments. The vast distance from civilization as she knew it, the absence of bookshops and libraries, theaters and concert halls, the stimulating intellectual conversations she had enjoyed in Boston's educated circles. "Though I find the children to be resilient despite their circumstances," she watched as Thomas, who had just been examined, made his way back to the classroom. The boy walked with his head down, shoulders hunched, a stark contrast to the confident figure who had stood in the forest clearing the previous night. Within the asylum walls, he, like all the children, adopted a posture of submission, a protective camouflage developed to avoid drawing unwanted attention. Dr. Pike lowered his voice, glancing around to ensure they were not overheard. "Reverend Thorne's methods are considered severe even by frontier standards. There have been concerns raised." This revelation piqued Miss Winters's interest, so she was not alone in questioning the Reverend's harsh approach. "What sort of concerns, if I may ask?" The doctor hesitated, clearly weighing how much to share with someone who was, after all, an employee of the asylum. His expression suggested an internal debate between professional discretion and moral obligation. "Among the settlers in the territory there are whispers," he said finally, keeping his voice low. "Concerns about the welfare of the children here, the conditions, the discipline. But Reverend Thorne has powerful benefactors back east who trust his judgment, and out here, authority is seldom questioned." He paused as Mrs. Crow passed by at the end of the corridor, her keys jangling at her waist. When she had disappeared around the corner, he continued, his tone even more guarded. "There have been incidents. Children who have run away, only to be found in peculiar states of mind, speaking of places that don't exist, and others who have disappeared entirely." The doctor's words sent a chill through Miss Winters. They echoed too closely the strange behavior she had witnessed. The children's talk of hollow places and doors. "Disappeared?" she echoed, her mind racing to the previous night's encounter in the forest. Could there be some connection between these disappearances and the ritual she had interrupted? "The wilderness is unforgiving," Dr. Pike said grimly. "Wolves, exposure, falls. There are countless ways for the unwary to perish. When children flee in desperation, without proper planning or provisions, the outcome is often tragic." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that suggested deep weariness with the subject. "The official explanation is always the same. The child ran away and met with misfortune in the forest. No formal inquiries are ever conducted. Out here, the disappearance of an orphan child raises few questions, particularly when those children are of mixed heritage or native blood. The casual cruelty of this reality struck Miss Winters anew. In Boston, the disappearance of a child would prompt immediate concern, search parties, newspaper notices. Here, on the frontier, an orphan could vanish without causing so much as a ripple in the community's consciousness. One more life deemed expendable in the harsh calculus of frontier existence. Though, Dr. Pike paused, seeming to debate whether to continue. "Please, doctor," Miss Winters urged. "If there is something I should know for the safety of my pupils, I beg you to share it." Her concern was genuine. If children had disappeared under circumstances similar to what she had witnessed, if there was any connection between the strange ritual in the clearing and these vanishings, she needed to understand it, for the children's sake and perhaps for her own peace of mind. Dr. Pike studied her face, apparently judging her sincerity. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him, for he nodded slightly and continued in a hushed tone. "I have an interest in local folklore, the stories and beliefs of the native peoples, the legends that take root in isolated communities. It's something of a personal study outside my medical practice." He glanced around once more, ensuring their privacy. "There are stories among the native peoples of this region, the Chinook and the Multnomah, of places in the forest where the boundary between worlds grows thin. Doorways, they call them, though that's a simplification of their concept. They believe certain individuals, usually children, can perceive these thresholds." Miss Winters felt her pulse quicken. Doorways in the forest. It was too similar to the children's talk of the hollow place to be coincidence. "And what lies beyond these doorways?" "That varies depending on who tells the tale," the doctor replied. "Some say it is a land of plenty, where hunger and cold are unknown. Others claim it is the realm of spirits, neither heaven nor hell, but something altogether different. The natives typically avoid such places, marking them with warnings." He shook his head slightly, a self-deprecating gesture. "I know how this must sound to an educated woman from Boston. Frontier superstition, nothing more. But I've interviewed dozens of individuals from different tribes, and the consistency of their accounts is remarkable. They describe similar locations, similar phenomena, without having had contact with each other." Miss Winters considered her response carefully. As a woman of education and Christian upbringing, she should dismiss such tales as pagan superstition. Yet the memory of the glowing stone, the children singing, the strange energy in the clearing, these experiences had already forced her to question the boundaries of her understanding. "And you believe these stories might be related to the disappearances from Blackwood?" she asked, keeping her tone neutral. Dr. Pike shrugged slightly. "I merely note the parallels. Children who vanish without trace, others who are found wandering, speaking of doors and other worlds. The proximity of this asylum to areas the natives consider significant." He gestured vaguely toward the forest visible through the window. "It may be nothing more than coincidence, or the influence of native stories on impressionable young minds. But in my profession, I've learned to consider all possibilities, however unlikely they may seem." Before Miss Winters could inquire further, they were interrupted by Mrs. Beatrice Crow, who informed them that Reverend Thorne wished to speak with the doctor. The matron's sour expression suggested she disapproved of the extended conversation between Miss Winters and Dr. Pike, perhaps suspecting a kind of impropriety in their private discussion. "I'll return shortly to continue the examinations," Dr. Pike said to Miss Winters. "Perhaps you could prepare the next group of children?" With a sympathetic nod to Miss Winters, Dr. Pike followed the matron, leaving her alone with her troubling thoughts. The doctor's account of native beliefs regarding forest doorways aligned too closely with what she had witnessed to be dismissed as mere coincidence. Yet accepting the possibility that such doorways might actually exist would require her to abandon fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality itself. That afternoon, during the children's brief recreational period, a mere 30 minutes when they were permitted to play in the asylum's fenced yard, Miss Winters approached Thomas, who seemed to be the leader of the group she had encountered in the forest. The boy was standing apart from the others, watching younger children half-heartedly push a hoop across the packed snow with a stick. Despite the opportunity for play, most children moved listlessly, conserving energy in the cold, their gaunt faces expressionless. Thomas noticed her approach and straightened, his posture becoming more guarded. Within the asylum grounds, he was careful to maintain the appearance of perfect obedience, his defiance hidden beneath a mask of compliance that had likely been cultivated through harsh experience. "I would like to understand more about this place you and the others were seeking last night," she said quietly, ensuring no one could overhear. She had positioned herself with her back to the building, where Mrs. Crow might be watching from a window, making it appear as though she were simply observing the children at play. Thomas regarded her warily, his eyes darting briefly to the main building before returning to her face. He was a handsome boy despite his pallor and thinness, with intelligent features and eyes that seemed older than his years, eyes that had witnessed more suffering than any child should. "Adults don't believe in it," he said finally, his voice low. "They can't see the signs." His response confirmed what Miss Winters had begun to suspect, that whatever the children believed about the hollow place, it was part of a shared understanding, a secret knowledge passed among them and hidden from adult authority. "What signs?" Miss Winters pressed. After a moment's hesitation, Thomas reached into his pocket and produced a small object, a stone, smooth and black, with a single white line running through its center like a vein of quartz. It was about the size of a robin's egg, polished to a high sheen that suggested long handling. Despite the cold, the stone seemed to carry a warmth of its own, though Miss Winters told herself this was merely the residual heat from being kept in the boy's pocket. "The markers," he said, holding the stone so that the white line caught the winter sunlight. "They show the way to the hollow place. Only children can see them glowing at night." Miss Winters studied the stone. It appeared ordinary enough, perhaps unusual in its perfect smoothness and the stark contrast between the black base and white line, but nothing that would suggest supernatural properties. "May I?" she asked, extending her hand. Thomas hesitated, then placed the stone in her palm. She was surprised to find it was indeed warm, warmer than could be explained by body heat alone, especially given the frigid air. Its surface was smoother than it had appeared, almost frictionless, like polished glass. The white line seemed to catch the light in unusual ways, appearing to shift slightly as she turned the stone, though the line itself remained stationary. "And who placed these markers?" Miss Winters asked, returning the stone to Thomas, who quickly secreted it back in his pocket. Thomas shrugged. "They've always been there. The native children knew about them before they were brought here. They taught the rest of us how to follow them." This aligned with what Dr. Pike had told her about local native beliefs regarding forest thresholds. Had the indigenous orphans brought these beliefs with them to Blackwood, sharing their knowledge with the other children? Or was there something more tangible behind the legends? Some actual phenomenon in the forest that both native traditions and the children's experiences reflected? And this hollow place, what is it exactly? Miss Winters asked, careful to keep her voice neutral, neither dismissive nor overly eager. She wanted Thomas to understand she was taking him seriously, that his answers mattered. "It's a door to somewhere else," Thomas replied, his voice taking on a fervent quality that transformed his typically guarded expression. His eyes brightened, and for a moment, Miss Winters glimpsed the same animation she had seen in the forest clearing. "Somewhere warm, with plenty of food and no beatings. Somewhere we can be free." The longing in his voice was palpable, the desperate desire of a child trapped in misery, dreaming of escape. Was that all this was? A collective fantasy created by children seeking psychological refuge from their harsh reality. Such coping mechanisms were not uncommon. Miss Winters had read accounts of slaves developing elaborate spiritual beliefs that promised freedom and justice in another realm when it was denied in this one. Yet this didn't explain the stone's peculiar warmth, the glow she had witnessed in the clearing, the consistency of the children's accounts with native folklore collected independently by Dr. Pike. "How do you know this if you haven't opened the door?" Miss Winters challenged gently, watching Thomas's reaction closely. "Because sometimes it opens a little," said Sarah, who had approached silently and now stood beside Thomas. The small girl had an uncanny ability to move without drawing attention, a skill Miss Winters had noticed in several of the children, particularly those who had been at the asylum longest. Just a crack, enough to hear the music and feel the warm air. But it needs more of us, singing together, to open all the way. Sarah's words carried absolute conviction. She wasn't speaking of hopes or wishes, but of direct experience, or at least what she perceived as direct experience. Miss Winters found herself wondering about the nature of perception itself. If these children truly believed they had glimpsed another world through a crack in reality, was their experience any less real than her own perceptions of the ordinary world? "And the maps?" Miss Winters asked. "Why draw them for me?" The children exchanged glances. There was a silent communication between them, a weighing of trust versus risk. Finally, Thomas gave a barely perceptible nod, and Sarah turned back to Miss Winters. "We thought you might be different," Thomas admitted. "You're not like the Reverend or Mrs. Crow. You don't hit us when we make mistakes. You actually listen when we speak." He hesitated, then added in a lower voice, "We thought maybe you could help us." The admission touched Miss Winters deeply. Despite her short time at Blackwood, the children had identified her as someone potentially sympathetic to their plight. They had reached out in the only way they knew how, through the coded language of their maps, offering her entry into their secret world. "Help you how?" she asked softly. "To find this door." Sarah nodded eagerly. "Adults almost never see it, but some can if they really believe. If they're not, hardened." She struggled with the word, clearly repeating something she had heard rather than fully understanding its meaning. "Sometimes adults help us," Thomas added. "They sing with us, and that makes the door open wider. But then the adults get scared and make us stop just when it's about to work." Miss Winters was saved from responding by the ringing of the bell signaling the end of recreation. Mrs. Crow emerged from the main building, her perpetual scowl deepening as she noticed Miss Winters in close conversation with the children. As the children lined up to return inside, she noticed Dr. Pike watching from the asylum's entrance, a troubled expression on his face. He had apparently concluded his discussion with Reverend Thorne and had been observing her interaction with the children. His gaze met hers briefly, and something in his expression suggested he had guessed the nature of their conversation and that he had more to share on the subject. That night, Miss Winters found herself unable to sleep, torn between rational dismissal of the children's tales and a growing unease. The maps, the midnight excursion, the strange stone, all of it pointed to something beyond mere childish fantasy. And Dr. Pike's mention of native beliefs regarding thresholds between worlds only added to her disquiet. Her education and upbringing urged caution and skepticism. Tales of magical doorways to other realms belonged in fairy stories, not reality. Yet she could not dismiss what she had seen with her own eyes. The stone's unnatural glow, the strange light in the clearing, the children's unified belief and apparent immunity to the cold. Something was happening in the forest, something that defied conventional explanation. She sat at her desk, reviewing her journal entries since arriving at Blackwood. Had she missed signs earlier? Looking back, she noted patterns she hadn't initially recognized. Certain children who seemed to share a secret understanding, exchanges of small objects that might have been markers, like Thomas's stone, hushed conversations that ceased when adults approached. The asylum itself seemed to foster such secretiveness. Under Reverend Thorne's harsh regime, the children had learned that survival depended on concealing their true thoughts and feelings, on developing a hidden world beneath the surface of obedience. Was it so surprising they had extended this strategy to create a literal hidden world, a promised escape from their daily suffering? A sudden gust of wind rattled her window, and she rose to ensure it was securely latched. The night was clear but moonless, the darkness outside absolute save for the faint gleam of stars and the reflection of snow. As she moved to close the curtains, a flicker of movement caught her eye. She peered more intently into the darkness. There, at the edge of the forest, a light was moving among the trees. It was not the warm glow of a lantern or torch, but a cold bluish illumination that seemed to hover above the ground. It pulsed gently, its intensity waxing and waning like a heartbeat. As she watched, transfixed, the light separated into multiple points, forming a line that wound between the trees. With a start, Miss Winters realized the lights were following a path, the very path indicated on the children's maps. The glowing points marked the route through the forest to the clearing with the stone. These must be the markers Thomas had mentioned, visible now to her adult eyes, though the boy had claimed only children could see them glowing. What had changed? Why could she suddenly perceive what had allegedly been invisible to adults? Miss Winters had no answer, but she felt a compelling urge to follow the lights, to see where they led, to understand the mystery that had consumed the children of Blackwood. Without fully understanding her own actions, Miss Winters found herself once again donning her coat and boots. This time she brought a lantern, though she kept it unlit to avoid detection. She moved through the silent asylum with greater confidence than before, having learned which floorboards creaked and which doors hinged silently. The night air bit at her exposed skin as she slipped out the kitchen door and into the yard. The stars above seemed unusually bright, casting just enough light to navigate by once her eyes adjusted to the darkness. The glowing markers were clearly visible now, blue-white points of light hovering a few feet above the ground, forming a trail that led into the forest. Miss Winters followed, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. Was she making a terrible mistake? What if this was some elaborate trap? Yet something deeper than rational thought pulled her forward, a sense that she stood on the threshold of a discovery that would transform her understanding of the world. The path took her deeper into the forest than she had ventured previously. The trees here were ancient, their massive trunks covered in thick moss, their branches forming a cathedral-like canopy overhead. Snow lay less thickly on the ground, suggesting the dense foliage intercepted much of the snowfall. The glowing markers illuminated the path with their eerie blue light, sometimes hovering stationary above particular rocks or trees, sometimes moving slowly as if beckoning her forward. The silence was profound. No rustling of nocturnal creatures, no hooting of owls, just the sound of her own breathing and the crunch of frozen leaves beneath her feet. It was as though the forest itself were holding its breath, waiting. After what seemed like hours but might have been less than one, judging by the position of the stars through breaks in the canopy, she emerged into a larger clearing than the one she had found before. Here, the trees surrounding the open space had strangely twisted trunks, their branches reaching toward each other to form an almost perfect circle above. These must be the twisted trees depicted on the second map. In the center of the clearing stood a stone much larger than the one the children had gathered around. This one was roughly the size and shape of a door, standing upright and partially embedded in the earth. Its surface was covered in symbols that reminded Miss Winters of the markings on the children's maps: spirals, dots, and lines arranged in patterns that seemed to shift slightly when viewed from different angles. Even in the darkness, with no apparent source of illumination, the stone was clearly visible, not glowing exactly, but possessing a quality that set it apart from the surrounding darkness, as though it existed in its own relationship with light and shadow. As she approached, she noticed small objects placed around the base of the stone, offerings similar to those the children had brought: bits of food, carved trinkets, bright feathers, and polished stones. Some appeared fresh, others were weathered and decayed, suggesting this site had been visited for quite some time. There were more elaborate items as well: a small wooden doll with intricate painted features that resembled native craftsmanship, a string of glass beads that must have been a prized possession, a metal thimble worn smooth by handling, a tarnished silver locket containing a lock of golden hair. Each item seemed charged with significance, a token of hope or payment offered to whatever power the stone represented. Miss Winters was reminded of the votive offerings she had seen in European cathedrals: candles lit for saints, small trinkets left at shrines, physical manifestations of prayer and supplication. She knelt to examine the offerings more closely, struck by the poignancy of these small treasures. How desperate must these children have been to part with their few possessions? What hopes had they invested in this strange stone and its promised doorway? A noise behind her made her turn sharply. Dr. Pike stood at the edge of the clearing, his own lantern held high. The sudden light was almost blinding after the subtle luminescence of the markers and stone. "Miss Winters," he said, his voice a mixture of concern and relief, "I feared you might venture out tonight." She rose quickly, embarrassed at being discovered in what now seemed a foolish endeavor. How would she explain her presence in the forest in the middle of the night, kneeling before a stone surrounded by children's trinkets? It painted a picture of irrationality, perhaps even madness. A Boston-educated woman succumbing to frontier superstition. "You followed me?" she asked, brushing snow and leaves from her skirts, attempting to regain some semblance of dignity. "I followed the children," he corrected, stepping into the clearing. His boots left deep impressions in the snow, which was undisturbed save for Miss Winters' own tracks and a set of smaller footprints that must belong to the children. A group of them slipped out shortly after midnight. I was returning from attending a difficult birth at a settler's cabin a few miles distant and saw them crossing the asylum grounds. I lost their trail, but I suspected they might be heading for this place. Dr. Pike moved closer, his lantern casting long shadows across the clearing. He was dressed for the cold in a heavy woolen coat and fur hat, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. His expression was not judgmental, but curious, even eager, as he surveyed the clearing and the standing stone. "You know of it?" Miss Winters asked, surprised that the doctor would be aware of this specific location deep in the forest. Dr. Pike nodded grimly. "I've been documenting the local folklore as something of a personal study. This site is mentioned in several native accounts. They call it the speaking stone in their tongue. The speaking stone, Miss Winters repeated softly. The name seemed fitting. There was something about the stone that suggested communication, as though its symbols were a language waiting to be deciphered. Do they believe it? Speaks to them? Not in words precisely, Dr. Pike replied, setting his lantern on a fallen log and moving to examine the stone more closely. They say it whispers in dreams, calls to certain individuals, mostly children, occasionally adults with what they term open spirits. The local shamans leave offerings here during certain ceremonies, but warn against lingering or attempting to open the way, as they put it. He moved closer to examine the standing stone. The symbols are a mixture of native pictographs and something else entirely. I've not been able to decipher them. In the lantern light, the markings on the stone seemed to shift and change, as though they were fluid rather than carved. Miss Winters blinked, wondering if her eyes were playing tricks on her. The cold and the late hour might be affecting her perception. The children believe it's a doorway to another world, Miss Winters said, feeling slightly foolish as she spoke the words. Yet here, in this strange clearing with the symbols seeming to move on the stone's surface, the idea didn't seem as far-fetched as it would have in Boston's rational atmosphere. A better world. Yes, that's consistent with the legends, Dr. Pike murmured, tracing a spiral pattern on the stone's surface with his gloved finger. Where he touched, the stone seemed to respond, the marking briefly glowing brighter before fading back to its normal state. If he noticed this reaction, he gave no sign. The natives believe it opens only for children, and only at certain times when the conditions are right. What conditions? Miss Winters asked. The phase of the moon, the season, the presence of those with the sight. It varies depending on the account, Dr. Pike replied. Some say a specific song must be sung, others that certain offerings must be made. He gestured to the items arranged around the base of the stone. Though all agree that intention matters most, the door opens only for those who truly wish to pass through, who are drawn to what lies beyond. A twig snapped somewhere in the darkness beyond the clearing. Both adults turned, raising their lanterns. The light caught a flash of movement among the trees, a small figure darting between trunks. Then another. The children must be nearby, Miss Winters whispered. We should find them before they come to harm. Though she had spoken of harm, she found herself wondering what danger was truly greater, the physical perils of the forest or the soul-crushing existence awaiting the children back at Blackwood. If they believed in this door, if it represented hope to them, was it right to drag them back to certain misery? As they moved to leave the clearing, a strange sensation swept over Miss Winters, a vibration in the air, like the moment before a thunderclap. The hairs on her arms stood on end beneath her coat sleeves, and she turned back toward the stone. For an instant, though later she would question what she had seen, the stone appeared to shimmer, its solid surface becoming translucent. Through it, she glimpsed a landscape bathed in golden light, with rolling hills covered in wildflowers and a sky of impossible blue. The vision lasted only seconds, but in that brief moment, she felt a profound sense of peace and rightness, as though she were glimpsing a world where things were as they should be, rather than as they were. Then the vision was gone, leaving only the dark stone against the night. Did you? She began, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Pike was staring at the stone with wide eyes, his lantern held forgotten at his side, its light dimmed by the afterimage of what they had witnessed. Remarkable, he breathed. I've interviewed over a dozen witnesses who claim to have seen such a phenomenon, but to experience it myself, then I'm not imagining things? Miss Winters asked, her voice unsteady. The rational part of her mind was already constructing explanations. Exhaustion, the play of light and shadow, a shared hallucination induced by suggestion and the power of folklore. Yet none of these explanations seemed adequate to account for what she had just experienced. No, Dr. Pike assured her, his scientific detachment momentarily abandoned in the face of the inexplicable. I saw it too. The landscape, the light. It was exactly as described in the native accounts I've collected. His confirmation both relieved and disturbed her. Relief that she was not losing her grip on reality. Disturbance that reality itself might be more fluid, more mysterious than her education had prepared her to accept. Though what we're actually seeing is open to interpretation, he added, the scientist in him reasserting itself. It could be some natural phenomenon, gases from the earth causing hallucinations perhaps, or light reflecting in an unusual manner. Even as he offered these rational explanations, His tone suggested he believed otherwise. There was a quality to what they had witnessed that defied scientific categorization, a sense of rightness and completion, as though they had briefly glimpsed a world more real than their own rather than less. More movement in the surrounding forest, and suddenly children began emerging into the clearing. Not just the 7 Miss Winters had encountered previously, but nearly 20 of the orphanage's residents. They formed a circle around the stone, their faces solemn in the lantern light. Many wore only their night clothes with thin coats or blankets wrapped around their shoulders, yet none showed signs of discomfort from the cold. Their eyes gleamed with purpose and anticipation. "Children, this is dangerous," Miss Winters implored. "You must return to the asylum at once." "It's almost time," Thomas said, ignoring her plea. He had moved to the front of the group, assuming a leadership role that seemed natural to him. His eyes were fixed on the stone, which had begun to emit a faint luminescence, pulsing gently like a heartbeat. "We can feel it. The door wants to open tonight." The other children nodded in agreement, their faces alight with anticipation. They formed a perfect circle around the stone, equidistant from each other as though guided by some unseen geometry. Even the youngest stood with unusual stillness and focus. "This is nonsense," Dr. Pike said firmly, though Miss Winters noticed he was eyeing the stone with scientific curiosity. His lantern cast long shadows across the clearing, creating a dance of light and darkness as the children took their positions. "Whatever you believe you've seen, it's not a doorway to another world." "We've all seen it," Mary insisted. She stood directly across from Thomas in the circle, her birthmark seeming to shift and change in the flickering light. "Not just glimpses like tonight. Sometimes it opens wider, and we can hear voices calling to us from the other side." "What voices?" Miss Winters asked, a chill running through her despite herself. The stone's pulsing had intensified, and the air in the clearing felt charged, as though a storm were brewing despite the clear night sky. "Children who went before," Thomas explained. His voice had taken on a rhythmic quality, almost sing-song, that seemed to resonate with the pulsing of the stone. "They say they're happy there, that there's no cold or hunger or beatings." A murmur of agreement ran through the circle of children. Several of the youngest smiled at the mention of this promised land, their expressions showing more animation than Miss Winters had ever witnessed during daylight hours at the asylum. "Children who went before?" Dr. Pike repeated slowly, his scientific skepticism warring with the evidence before his eyes. The stone's glow had intensified, casting the children's faces in an ethereal light that transformed their usually gaunt features. "You mean orphans who have disappeared from Blackwood?" The children nodded solemnly. "How many?" the doctor pressed, his notebook forgotten in his pocket as he confronted a mystery far beyond his scientific categorization. 11 since I came here 2 years ago, Thomas replied. His gaze remained fixed on the stone, which now emitted a humming sound just at the threshold of hearing, more felt than heard, a vibration that seemed to resonate with something deep in the chest. "The Reverend tells everyone they ran away or were taken by fever, but we know where they really went." Miss Winters and Dr. Pike exchanged troubled glances. The doctor's earlier mention of disappearances took on a more ominous significance. Had children truly vanished through some inexplicable doorway? Or had something more sinister occurred, with the stone and its legends providing a convenient cover for more mundane horrors? "Even if what you believe were true," Miss Winters said gently, stepping closer to the circle, though careful not to break its formation, "you cannot simply vanish from this world. You have lives to lead, futures ahead of you." She spoke from genuine concern, despite her own uncertainty. Whatever was happening in this clearing, whether supernatural phenomenon or elaborate fantasy, the children were contemplating abandoning the only world they knew. As harsh as their lives at Blackwood might be, was disappearance into the unknown truly preferable? "What futures?" asked a bitter voice. It belonged to a thin boy of about 14 whom Miss Winters recognized as James, one of the older orphans. His face bore a jagged scar along one cheek, legacy of some past violence, and his eyes held a hardness born of repeated disappointment. The boys get apprenticed to trappers or farmers who work them like mules. The girls get sent to be servants or wives for frontier men 3 times their age. That's if we survive the winters and the fevers. His words hung in the clearing, their harsh truth undeniable. Life on the frontier was brutal, and orphans without family connections faced particularly bleak prospects. The asylum was merely a way station on the path to servitude, or worse. Miss Winters had seen the records in Reverend Thorne's office, lists of children placed with settlers or trappers, their futures determined by the whims of adults who viewed them as cheap labor rather than young souls deserving of nurturing. "James is right," said Elizabeth, a quiet girl of 10 who rarely spoke during lessons. Her delicate features belied a fierce intelligence that Miss Winters had noted in her written work. "We're not people to them. We're burdens, or property. No one cares what becomes of us." Before either adult could respond, a sound rose from the forest, the crack of a branch under a heavy boot, followed by angry voices. The children tensed, their faces shifting from anticipation to fear. "They've discovered we're missing," Thomas said urgently. The stone's pulsing intensified, as though responding to the children's heightened emotions. "Quick, everyone take positions. This might be our only chance." The children scrambled to form a perfect circle around the stone, joining hands, their small fingers interlaced, creating an unbroken ring around the standing stone. The younger ones looked fearful, but determined, while the older children's faces showed grim resolve. Sarah pulled at Miss Winters' sleeve. "Please, miss," she pleaded, "stand with us. Maybe if you believe, you can see the way too." The child's earnest expression pierced Miss Winters' heart. In her few weeks at Blackwood, she had grown to care deeply for these children, to feel responsible for their welfare. What awaited them if they returned to the asylum? More cold, more hunger, more beatings, followed by futures of servitude and hardship. Yet the alternative, this doorway to another world, if it existed, was unknown, possibly dangerous in ways they couldn't foresee. Torn between duty and a growing conviction that something extraordinary was occurring, Miss Winters hesitated. Dr. Pike placed a restraining hand on her arm. "Miss Winters, I understand your sympathy for these children, but we cannot encourage this behavior," he said in a low voice. His expression was troubled, caught between scientific skepticism and the evidence of his senses. "Whatever they believe, they are placing themselves in real danger." The voices were growing closer, Reverend Thorne's distinctive baritone among them, shouting orders to search the forest. The sound carried clearly in the still night air, each word laden with fury. "Find them! Check every path! They cannot have gone far." Several of the children looked fearfully toward the sounds. The smallest ones trembled, their eyes wide with dread at the prospect of punishment. Miss Winters knew what awaited them if caught. Confinement in the dark cells, perhaps beatings, certainly days of hunger as their rations were reduced as punishment. "Now," Thomas commanded, "before they find us." The children began to sing, the same haunting melody Miss Winters had heard on her previous encounter, but louder now, with more voices joining in harmony. The strange language flowed from their lips as if they had been born speaking it, the syllables forming patterns that seemed to resonate with the symbols on the stone. As they sang, an extraordinary transformation began to take place. The air around the stone seemed to ripple, like the surface of a pond disturbed by a thrown pebble. The stone itself began to glow with a soft, pulsing light that illuminated the children's faces from below, casting their features in gold and amber rather than the previous blue-white luminescence. "Fascinating," murmured Dr. Pike, his scientific skepticism momentarily forgotten as he stared at the phenomenon. The combined resonance of their voices must be triggering some kind of reaction in the mineral composition of the stone. But Miss Winters was not convinced by this explanation. The light emanating from the stone was taking on colors she had no words to describe, hues that seemed to exist in the spaces between known colors. And within those colors, shapes were forming, resolving into a landscape similar to the one she had glimpsed earlier. The clearing had grown warmer despite the winter night, as though summer air were flowing from the stone itself. A sweet scent wafted through the air, wildflowers and fresh bread and something indefinable yet deeply comforting. The children's singing grew stronger, more confident, as though they could sense the barrier between worlds thinning. "Stop this at once!" Reverend Thorne's voice boomed across the clearing as he emerged from the trees, lantern held high, his face a mask of fury. His tall figure was imposing in the lantern light, his shadow stretching across the snow like a reaching darkness. Behind him came Mrs. Crow and 2 men Miss Winters recognized as workers from the asylum's grounds. They carried lanterns and what appeared to be lengths of rope, presumably to bind any children who resisted. "Devil's work!" the Reverend bellowed, his eyes wide with outrage as he took in the scene. The glowing stone, the circle of children, the shifting light that seemed to be forming a doorway in the very air. "Cease this ungodly ritual immediately." The children's singing faltered momentarily, fear of the Reverend's wrath momentarily overcoming their determination. The light from the stone dimmed slightly, the rippling in the air becoming less pronounced. Thomas, however, urged them on with fierce whispers. "Don't stop, it's working." Indeed, the light from the stone had intensified, and now it seemed to be expanding outward, creating what appeared to be an opening in the very air before it. Through this opening, Miss Winters could clearly see rolling meadows, a bubbling stream, and what looked like a village of small cottages in the distance. The scene was bathed in golden sunlight, though it was the middle of the night in their world. Butterflies flitted among wildflowers, and in the distance figures moved about, children running and playing without the hunched postures and fearful expressions that characterized the orphans of Blackwood. "Cease this devil's work immediately," Reverend Thorne commanded, striding toward the circle of children. His face was contorted with rage, a vein pulsing at his temple. Mrs. Crow followed close behind, her keys jangling ominously at her waist. Her thin lips curved in anticipation of the punishments to come. "Mrs. Crow, fetch the switch. These children will learn the consequences of trafficking with dark forces." But as the Reverend approached, something unexpected happened. He seemed to hit an invisible barrier at the edge of the children's circle. Try as he might, he could not pass through to reach the stone. His body pressed against something unseen but impenetrable, like a glass wall surrounding the children and their glowing portal. "What devilry is this?" he sputtered, his face reddening with rage and exertion as he pushed against the unseen force. Mrs. Crow and the workers encountered the same barrier, their attempts to reach the children blocked by invisible means. "They can't enter," Thomas said with a note of triumph. "Adults who don't believe can't cross." The opening before the stone had grown larger now, nearly the size of a doorway. A warm breeze wafted through it, carrying the scent of flowers and fresh bread. Miss Winters heard laughter from somewhere beyond, the unmistakable sound of children playing, without the strain of fear or hunger that colored the rare moments of mirth at Blackwood. The contrast between the worlds could not have been more stark. On one side, the cold, dark forest and the furious figures of Reverend Thorne and his staff. On the other, sunlight, warmth, and the promise of freedom. The doorway itself shimmered at the edges, its boundaries fluid and shifting, the light from within casting the children's faces in a golden glow that transformed their gaunt features into something almost radiant. "Miss Winters, Dr. Pike," Thomas called urgently. The boy's face was alight with hope and anticipation, his usual guarded expression completely gone. He gestured toward the opening, which pulsed in time with the children's continued singing. "You must decide. Do you believe? Will you help us?" Miss Winters looked at the beckoning doorway, then at the children's hopeful faces, and finally at Reverend Thorne's contorted visage as he continued to rail against their blasphemy. In that moment she understood that something miraculous was occurring, something beyond her rational understanding but no less real for it. The choice before her was clear. She could side with Reverend Thorne and his harsh regime, condemning these children to continued suffering, or she could embrace the inexplicable, taking a leap of faith into the unknown in hope of a better future for her charges. "I believe you," she said softly, moving to join the circle. To her surprise, she passed through the barrier that had stopped the Reverend, taking her place between Sarah and Mary in the ring of children. Their small hands clasped hers warmly, and she felt a surge of something like electricity pass through the connection, not painful but invigorating, as though she were being awakened to possibilities previously unimagined. Dr. Pike watched in astonishment. "Miss Winters, consider what you're doing." His scientific mind clearly warred with the evidence before his eyes, the glowing stone, the visible doorway to another world, the barrier that admitted some but rejected others. "This defies all natural law." "I am," she replied calmly. The certainty in her voice surprised even herself. "For the first time since arriving here, I'm seeing clearly. These children deserve better than what this world has offered them." Outside the circle, Reverend Thorne's fury intensified. "Miss Winters, I will see you dismissed without references. You will never teach again." His threats echoed through the clearing, but they seemed increasingly distant and irrelevant as the doorway expanded, the golden light spilling into the winter forest like sunrise breaking through darkness. Dr. Pike hesitated, his expression a study in conflicting impulses. The physician and scientist in him insisted this could not be happening, that there must be a rational explanation. Yet his eyes told him otherwise. And beneath his educated skepticism lay a man who had spent years documenting native accounts of doorways between worlds, a man who, perhaps, had always hoped to find evidence that reality contained more wonders than his scientific training acknowledged. "Dr. Pike," called Thomas, "the door won't stay open much longer. You must choose." The doctor looked from the furious Reverend to the glowing doorway, from the children's hopeful faces to Miss Winter's extended hand. Then, with a deep breath, he stepped forward and passed through the barrier to join the circle opposite Miss Winter's. "This is madness," he muttered, though whether to her or himself was unclear. Absolute madness, yet his expression held wonder rather than fear, and his hand clasped Thomas's firmly as he completed the circle. With both adults now part of the circle, the singing grew stronger, and the doorway expanded until it was large enough for even the tallest among them to pass through comfortably. The scene beyond became more detailed. Miss Winters could make out individual flowers in the meadows, ripples on the stream's surface, smoke rising from the chimneys of the distant cottages. The warm air flowing through the opening carried sounds as well: birdsong, the distant laughter of children, the gentle rustle of leaves in a summer breeze. "It's time," Thomas announced, breaking the circle to approach the doorway. He paused at the threshold, looking back at the others. The portal's light transformed his face, erasing the signs of deprivation and hardship, revealing the child he might have been under happier circumstances. "Who's coming?" Outside the circle, Reverend Thorne had sent Mrs. Crow running back to the asylum for reinforcements. Now he stood impotently at the barrier, his threats growing increasingly desperate as he realized his authority was slipping away. "Anyone who steps through that ungodly portal will never be permitted to return to Blackwood," he shouted. "You will be outcast, abandoned to whatever hellish fate awaits you." His words, intended to frighten the children into submission, had the opposite effect. One by one they broke from the circle and moved toward the doorway. The smallest children went first, guided by the older ones, their faces transformed from fear to wonder as they approached the threshold. Sarah tugged at Miss Winter's hand. "Come with us, miss. Please." The child's eyes were luminous with hope, a stark contrast to the dull resignation they had held within the asylum walls. Miss Winters looked down at the child's hopeful face, then back at the asylum's dark silhouette visible through the trees. What awaited these children there? Cold, hunger, servitude, a life of hardship with little joy. And what lay beyond the doorway? Unknown, yes, but filled with possibility. "I'll come," she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. The decision, which should have felt momentous, instead carried a sense of inevitability, as though her entire life had been leading to this crossroads, this choice between the world she knew and one she could scarcely imagine. Dr. Pike approached, his expression troubled. "Miss Winters, we cannot simply vanish with over 20 children. There will be investigations, accusations. We have responsibilities in this world." His concern was valid. In the eyes of society, what they contemplated would appear as kidnapping at best, madness at worst. Their reputations, their professional standings, their very identities would be forfeit. They would become the subject of frontier legends themselves. The teacher and doctor who disappeared with a group of orphans into the forest, never to be seen again. "Our responsibility is to these children," she countered. "What future can we honestly promise them here? You've seen how they're treated, the conditions they endure." She gestured toward Reverend Thorne, who continued to rage against the barrier, his face purple with fury, spittle flying as he invoked divine punishment upon them all. Behind him, more staff from the asylum had arrived, armed with lanterns and ropes, their expressions a mixture of anger and bewilderment at the scene before them. "And you believe that whatever lies beyond that doorway offers something better?" he asked, gesturing to the portal of light. Miss Winters considered the question carefully. The rational part of her mind, the educated Bostonian raised on Enlightenment principles, insisted this was folly. Yet another part of her, perhaps the same intuitive sense that had drawn her west in search of purpose, recognized that reality might contain more mysteries than her education had prepared her to accept. "I believe it offers hope," she replied simply, "more than they have here." She looked through the doorway again at the sunlit landscape beyond. Was it a trap, an illusion, a shared hallucination? Perhaps. But what awaited the children if they returned to Blackwood was no illusion. The basement cells, the switch, the hunger and cold, followed by years of servitude and hardship. Even if what lay beyond the doorway proved disappointing, could it truly be worse than what they faced here? The doctor ran a hand through his hair, clearly torn. His scientific training warred with the evidence of his senses, with the compassion that had led him to medicine in the first place. This defies all rational explanation. I should be declaring us all victims of mass hysteria or poisoning from some forest fungus. And yet, his voice trailed off as he gazed at the inviting landscape beyond the threshold. Several children had already stepped through, their figures becoming distant as they ran joyfully toward the meadows. None showed any sign of distress or danger. Rather, they moved with an energy and freedom that Miss Winters had never witnessed during their time at Blackwood. "I need to understand," Dr. Pike said finally. "As a man of science, I cannot turn away from such a discovery, however impossible it seems." Miss Winters smiled. "Then you'll come." "I'll come," he agreed. "God help me, but I'll come." Outside the barrier, Reverend Thorne had begun to pray loudly, invoking divine protection against what he deemed a demonic manifestation. Mrs. Crow had returned with several more workers, all of whom were trying unsuccessfully to break through the invisible wall surrounding the stone. "We should hurry," Thomas urged. "The door won't stay open much longer." With a nod, Miss Winters took Sarah's hand and approached the threshold. The air shimmed before her, warm and inviting. Beyond, she could see children already exploring the meadows, their laughter carrying back through the doorway. Taking a deep breath, she stepped through, Sarah at her side. The sensation was indescribable, like passing through a curtain of warm water that left no moisture, or a beam of sunlight given substance. For an instant, she felt weightless, suspended between worlds. And then she was through, standing on soft grass under a sky more vividly blue than any she had ever seen. The air was sweet with the scent of wildflowers and fruit trees in bloom, despite the winter season they had left behind. Dr. Pike followed moments later, his scientific composure momentarily abandoned as he gazed in wonder at their surroundings. "Extraordinary," he breathed. "Absolutely extraordinary." He immediately began examining their surroundings with scientific curiosity, touching the grass, studying the flowers, testing the solidity of the ground beneath their feet. Everything appeared real, tangible, subject to the same physical laws as the world they had left, yet somehow enhanced, colors more vivid, scents more pronounced, the very air seeming to carry a vitality absent from the world of Blackwood. One by one, the remaining children passed through the doorway, 26 in all, ranging from little ones of 4 or 5 to teenagers on the cusp of adulthood. They spread out across the meadow, running, laughing, touching everything, as if to confirm its reality. Their threadbare clothing and gaunt faces seemed incongruous in this idyllic setting, like shadows from another world gradually fading in the sunlight. Thomas was the last to come through. As he did, the doorway began to shrink behind him, the light diminishing. "Quickly," he called to the others. "Come see." They gathered around the narrowing portal, which now offered a window-like view back into the forest clearing. Through it, they could see Reverend Thorne and the others still raging impotently against the barrier. As the opening contracted to a mere window between worlds, Miss Winters caught a final glimpse of the Reverend's face, a mask of fury and fear that would haunt her dreams for years to come. Then the doorway closed completely, leaving only a shimmer in the air that quickly faded, like ripples dissipating on a pond's surface after a stone has sunk to the bottom. "Is it gone for good?" Miss Winters asked Thomas, a sudden anxiety gripping her. Had they truly crossed into another world? Was there no way back if this place proved dangerous or unwelcoming? The boy shook his head. "The older children who came before told us it appears in different places, at different times. They said once you've passed through, you can learn to sense when it will open again. So we could return if we wished?" Dr. Pike asked, already pulling a small notebook from his pocket and beginning to document their surroundings. His scientific training reasserted itself even in these extraordinary circumstances. Observation, documentation, analysis. He sketched the landscape quickly, noting the positions of geographical features and the strange configurations of stars visible in the daylight sky. "We could," Thomas replied. "But why would we want to?" Indeed, as Miss Winters surveyed their new environment, she found it difficult to imagine choosing to return to the cold, harsh world they had left behind. Here the air was temperate, the landscape bountiful. In the distance she could see a village of charming cottages, with smoke rising from chimneys and figures moving about, figures that appeared to be children primarily, though she thought she glimpsed adults as well. "Who lives there?" she asked, pointing to the settlement. It nestled against a gentle hillside surrounded by orchards and gardens. The buildings were modest but well-maintained, constructed of stone and timber with thatched roofs. A stream ran through the center of the village, crossed by several small footbridges. "Children who came before," Sarah explained, her small hand still clasped in Miss Winter's. The girl's face had already lost some of its pinched quality, her eyes brighter in the warm sunlight. "And some grown-ups who believed, like you. They welcome newcomers and help them settle in. And there's really enough for everyone?" Miss Winters asked, her practical mind still questioning the apparent paradise. Years of living in a world of scarcity and struggle made such abundance seem suspicious. Too good to be true. Was this some elaborate illusion, a shared dream from which they would awaken to find themselves still in the forest clearing, or worse, back at Blackwood? "More than enough," Thomas assured her. "The land provides whatever is needed. You'll see." His confidence was echoed in the faces of the other children, who had begun gathering around them again after their initial explorations. Gone was the wariness, the hunched postures, the automatic flinching at sudden movements. Already they stood straighter, moved more freely, their faces animated by curiosity and excitement rather than fear. As they made their way toward the village, Miss Winters found herself reflecting on the extraordinary chain of events that had led them here. Had she lost her mind? Was this all an elaborate delusion? Or had she stumbled upon a mystery beyond human understanding, a place where the rules of her known world simply didn't apply? Beside her, Dr. Pike seemed to be wrestling with similar questions. "I should be recording all of this," he muttered, scribbling furiously in his notebook, documenting every detail for scientific posterity. And yet who would believe it? Who could possibly comprehend what we've experienced without seeing it themselves? "Perhaps that's why only children can usually find the way," Miss Winter suggested. "Their minds aren't yet bound by rigid notions of what is and isn't possible." "A fair point," the doctor acknowledged, "though it raises profound questions about the nature of reality itself. If a place like this can exist, what other wonders might lie beyond our perception, simply because we've been taught they cannot be?" The philosophical implications were staggering. Was this truly another world? A parallel reality existing alongside their own? Or was it somehow constructed from their collective desires and hopes, a shared dream made tangible? Dr. Pike's scientific mind would likely spend years grappling with these questions, Miss Winters realized, just as her own educator's intellect would seek to understand and categorize this new realm. As they neared the village, figures emerged to greet them, children of various ages, some of whom the Blackwood orphans recognized with cries of joy. There were tearful reunions with those who had disappeared from the asylum in previous months and years, children thought lost to the wilderness or disease, now healthy and thriving in this strange new world. There were adults too, though fewer in number, watching with warm smiles as the newcomers arrived. They appeared to be of various ages and backgrounds, some dressed in clothing reminiscent of frontier settlers, others in garments Miss Winters couldn't quite categorize, of unusual cut and material. All seemed healthy and well-fed, without the weathered hardness that characterized most frontier adults. A woman stepped forward, perhaps in her 30s, with kind eyes and an air of quiet authority. Her brown hair was worn in a simple braid, and she dressed in a practical dress of blue linen, clean and well-made but without ornamentation. "Welcome to Evergreen," she said. "My name is Margaret Reed. I was once a teacher at an orphanage in Pennsylvania. Not unlike your Blackwood. I found my way here 7 years ago, following a group of children much like yours." "Eleanor Winters," Miss Winters replied, taking the offered hand. "And this is Dr. Ambrose Pike. I hardly know how to explain our presence here." Margaret smiled. "There's no need to explain. Everyone who finds their way to Evergreen does so because they were meant to. The door opens only for those with the hearts to see it." As they were led into the village, Miss Winters was struck by the harmonious nature of the community. Children and adults worked together without the harsh hierarchy she was accustomed to seeing. The cottages were simple but comfortable, the gardens abundant with vegetables and fruits that should not have been in season. "How is this possible?" she asked, gesturing to a tree heavy with ripe apples. "It was winter where we came from. The seasons here follow their own rhythm," Margaret explained. "They change, but not in the way you're used to. We have times of growth and times of rest, but never the bitter cold or scorching heat that makes life so difficult in your world." Margaret nodded. "Because it is. Evergreen exists alongside your world, but separate from it, connected only by the doorways that appear from time to time. The native peoples of your region understood this better than the settlers. They recognized that reality has many layers, many dimensions that most cannot perceive. Dr. Pike had been listening intently, his notebook forgotten as he absorbed Margaret's explanation. The physics of it, he began, his scientific curiosity evident. The doorway we passed through, how does it function? What energy sustains it? Margaret smiled patiently. Dr. Pike, I understand your need to categorize and explain. I felt the same when I first arrived. But you'll find that some aspects of Evergreen resist scientific analysis, at least as science is understood in your world. Before the doctor could press further, they were approached by several children eager to show the newcomers around the village. The Blackwood orphans integrated quickly, their initial wariness giving way to wonder as they were introduced to their new home. They were shown to comfortable dormitories where they would stay until more permanent arrangements could be made. Clean, well-lit rooms with proper beds and warm blankets. So unlike the cramped, cold sleeping quarters at Blackwood, that evening, a feast was held to welcome the newcomers. Tables were set up in the village square, laden with fresh bread, roasted meats, vegetables, and fruits of all kinds. The children from Blackwood, accustomed to meager portions of bland porridge, ate with astonished delight. Where does all this come from? Miss Winters asked Margaret as they watched the children enjoying their meal. The food, the materials for your homes. I see no signs of commerce or external supply routes. We are largely self-sufficient, Margaret replied. The land here is exceptionally fertile and the climate favorable for growing. We raise animals, cultivate crops, and craft what we need. But there's something more, a quality to Evergreen that's difficult to explain. The land provides in ways that defy conventional understanding. Seeds grow faster, animals thrive with less tending, materials last longer without wear. As night fell, lanterns were lit around the square, casting a warm glow over the gathering. Music began. Sweet, melodious tunes played on instruments Miss Winters had never seen before, with harmonies that seemed to resonate with something deep within her soul. It's the same music, Sarah whispered, nestled against Miss Winters' side. The music we could hear through the door when it opened just a little. Later, as the children were settled into temporary lodgings, Miss Winters found herself sitting with Dr. Pike and several of the adult residents beside a communal fire pit. The night was mild, the stars overhead arranged in unfamiliar patterns that the doctor had been studying with fascination. I still don't understand, she admitted. What is this place? How can it exist alongside our world yet remain hidden from it? An older man named Joseph, who had been introduced as someone with extensive knowledge of Evergreen's history, leaned forward. His white hair and beard framed a face lined with age but lit by bright, youthful eyes. The native peoples of your region have stories of such places. Thin spots between worlds where the boundaries can be crossed under certain conditions. They believe these crossings have existed since the beginning of time. But the physics of it, Dr. Pike insisted, leaning forward eagerly. His scientific curiosity had only grown with each new observation of this strange world. The laws of nature as we understand them don't allow for such possibilities. Joseph smiled patiently. Perhaps your understanding of those laws is incomplete. The universe is vast and mysterious, with many layers of reality existing simultaneously. Like pages in a book, suggested Margaret. Separate yet connected, each containing its own story. And this, Evergreen? Miss Winters asked, gesturing to the peaceful village around them. It's one such page? It's a refuge, Joseph replied. A place that exists for those who need it most, particularly children who have been abandoned or mistreated by your world. It has been called many names throughout history, appearing in the folklore of cultures across the globe. Tir Nanog to the Irish, Shambhala to those in the East, the Land of Youth to others. But how does it sustain itself? Dr. Pike wondered. The economy, the resources. It seems impossible. Many things seem impossible until they're experienced, Margaret pointed out. As for sustenance, Evergreen provides what is needed. We cultivate crops, raise animals, build shelters, but with a harmony and abundance your world has lost. As the conversation continued into the night, Miss Winters found her rational doubts giving way to acceptance. Whatever Evergreen was, whether an actual different world, a hidden valley with unusual properties, or something beyond human categorization, it was real. The children were happy here, safe and well-fed. They were learning and growing without the specter of abuse or neglect hanging over them. In the days that followed, Both Miss Winters and Dr. Pike found roles within the community. She continued teaching, though with a curriculum far more joyful and engaging than anything Reverend Thorne would have permitted. The children learned not just reading, writing, and arithmetic, but music, art, natural sciences, and the unique history of Evergreen itself. The doctor established a small infirmary, marveling at the general health of the residents and the unusual properties of local plants with medicinal qualities unknown in the outside world. He began compiling a comprehensive study of Evergreen's flora and fauna, documenting species that existed nowhere else and properties that defied conventional biological understanding. The children from Blackwood flourished, their pinched faces filling out, their wary expressions giving way to open curiosity and joy. They learned the ways of Evergreen quickly, how to tend the gardens, care for the animals, and navigate the surrounding forests safely. The transformation was remarkable. Children who had flinched at sudden movements now laughed freely. Those who had hoarded food now shared generously. Those who had been silent now sang. One evening, about a month after their arrival, Miss Winters found Thomas sitting alone on a hillside overlooking the village, his expression thoughtful. The sunset painted the landscape in hues of gold and amber, casting long shadows across the valley. In the distance, the lights of the village were beginning to twinkle as lanterns were lit for the evening. "Is everything all right?" she asked, settling beside him on the grass. A gentle breeze carried the scent of wildflowers and baking bread from the village below. "I was just thinking about the others," he replied. "The children still at Blackwood, and in other places like it." Miss Winters nodded soberly. "I think of them too." In the month since their arrival, she had often found her thoughts returning to those left behind, not just the remaining children at Blackwood, but all those suffering in similar institutions across the country. The contrast between their current idyllic existence and the harsh realities they had escaped made the plight of those still trapped all the more poignant. "We should go back for them," Thomas said suddenly, turning to face her with newfound determination in his eyes. "When the door opens again, we should bring more children here." His words stirred something in Miss Winters, a sense of purpose she had been missing. Their escape had saved 26 children. But what of the thousands more? What of those still enduring cold and hunger, beatings and neglect? Did they not deserve the same chance at happiness that Thomas and the others had found? "Yes," she agreed, "we should." And so began a new chapter in the story of Evergreen. Under the guidance of those who had come before, Miss Winters, Dr. Pike, and the older children learned to sense when and where the doorway would appear next. They developed a system of maps, far more sophisticated than the crude drawings that had first led them to the stone, marking potential crossing points and the signs that preceded an opening. Joseph taught them to recognize the subtle vibrations in the air, the quality of light, the behavior of local wildlife that indicated a thinning between worlds. Margaret shared techniques for focusing their minds, for maintaining the belief and openness that seemed necessary to perceive the doorways. The children, with their natural sensitivity to such phenomena, often sensed the openings before the adults could. Over the years, they made periodic journeys back to the world they had left, seeking out orphanages and workhouses where children suffered, offering escape to those willing to believe. Not all could see the doorway, even when standing before it. Some adults, their minds too rigid with disbelief, perceived nothing but empty air where others saw a portal to paradise. Their first return was the most difficult, a journey back to Blackwood 6 months after their departure according to Evergreen time. They found the asylum much changed. The disappearance of 26 children, along with a teacher and visiting physician, had caused a scandal that reached as far as Boston. Reverend Thorne had been removed from his position, the official explanation citing negligence leading to tragedy, the authorities having concluded that the missing had perished in the wilderness during an ill-advised excursion. A new administrator had been appointed, one less harsh but no more caring, viewing the orphans as burdens to be managed rather than young souls to be nurtured. The conditions remained poor, the futures offered to the children still bleak. Under cover of night, Miss Winters and Thomas led another 15 children through a doorway that had appeared in the asylum's root cellar. Other journeys followed, to orphanages in Portland, Seattle, San Francisco, and beyond. As years passed in the outside world, the legend grew. Rumors spread in the outside world, whispered tales of children who vanished in the night, leaving behind mysterious maps. Authorities dismissed these stories as folklore or attributed the disappearances to more mundane causes: runaways, disease, accidents in the wilderness. Yet the maps continued to appear, passed from child to child, hidden from the eyes of skeptical adults. Children would whisper of the hollow place, of doors that appeared in walls or trees or stones, of a world where winter never bit with cruel teeth and no one went hungry. They drew the symbols they had learned from others, taught the songs that helped open the way, kept alive the hope that they too might find escape from suffering, and somewhere, beyond the veil of ordinary perception, a community thrived, a place where those who had been forgotten by the world found belonging, and those who had suffered found peace. As for Miss Eleanor Winters, she never regretted her decision that winter night in 1817. In her journal, preserved in the Evergreen Library alongside Dr. Pike's scientific observations, she wrote, "I came west seeking purpose, little knowing that purpose would lead me beyond the boundaries of the world I knew. Here, I have found not just a home, but a mission, to be the guide I needed when I was lost, and to help others find their way to the light." The children's maps, it is said, can still be found occasionally, tucked into the pages of old books, hidden beneath floorboards in abandoned buildings, or etched into the bark of ancient trees. They lead to different places now, the doorway shifting over time, but those with eyes to see and hearts to believe can still follow them to Evergreen, where the air is sweet, the welcome warm, and no child is ever forgotten. And if, in your travels through the wild places of this world, you should come upon a stone standing alone in a clearing, with strange symbols etched upon its surface and small offerings laid at its base, listen carefully. Some say that if you're very quiet, and if your heart is open to wonder, you might hear the distant laughter of children playing beyond a door that few can see, children who found their way to a place where they could finally be free.